The three-day trade talks between China and the United States is believed to wrap up in Beijing. It was the first face-to-face negotiation since the Chinese and U.S. presidents met and agreed to dial back tensions last month. The trade friction between the world's largest economies last year cast a shadow over bilateral ties. Now both sides are trying to fix long-standing grievances about how to do business with each other. Let's take a look.
A new round of trade talks. Negotiations between China and the U.S. resumed in Beijing. The talks were held at a vice ministerial level. It was scheduled from Monday to Tuesday, but ended on the third day, Wednesday. The two sides discussed how to push forward agreements reached last month between President Xi and Mr. Trump over dinner at the G20 summit when they agreed to a 90-day truce. Since then, China has announced a 3-month suspension of tariff hikes on American cars and parts. And the U.S. postponed increasing taxes on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. 4 rounds of major trade talks were held during tensions last year, since the U.S. first unveiled plans to impose more tariffs on Chinese goods last March. But the talks fell short of mending ties. The U.S. fired the first shot of the trade war in July last year, imposing 25% additional tariffs on $34 billion of Chinese goods, and China responded in kind. Since then, trade tensions escalated and the tariff lists covered a slew of exports to each other, from high-tech products to agricultural goods. If no deal is reached by March, the tit-for-tat tariffs will very likely be raised again.
For more on the U.S.-China trade negotiations, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Zhang Jianping, the Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation. Also in Beijing, we have Timothy Stratford, the Managing Partner of Covington and Burlington LLP's Beijing office. He is also now the Chairman of AmCham here in Beijing. Earlier, he served as Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China under President Bush. Welcome to our program, both of you. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Jeff Moon, an international trade and government affairs consultant, and earlier also Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China under President Obama. And also in Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, Managing Director of BOCOM International. We have a very strong panel, certainly a lot to talk about. But first of all, I want to make sure our audience understand together with us that we do not know necessarily the trade talks between the two sides are officially wrapped up or not, whether the U.S. delegation has left or not Beijing. We do not know whether there is yet a joint statement. Of course, we do not know if there were any joint statement, what is inside the statement. So there are a lot of unknown, and yet the fact is, Mr. Stratford, it continued to a third day, more than the earlier plan, the 2 days. What does it say?
Well, I think that's an optimistic note. It means that both sides thought that there was enough useful exchange that they wanted to continue the discussions for the third day.
Okay, Mr. Zhang, is that optimistic to you?
Yeah, I think that's a very good signal because you know that trade negotiation between two sides are very complicated. The 2 days is not enough, so we need to have more time.
I don't even think 90 days would be enough. There are a lot of things to unveil and also to discuss. Mr. Hong, the market is reacting. It is coming back to the highest point, some say, in a month. I think certainly there's people that are optimistic. Mr. Hong.
Yeah, I think the market agree with the panel's optimistic sentiment. It's continue to push for new highs since the December sell-off. So I would say that the market is looking optimistic, and the market tend to be right in advance.
Mr. Moon, how do you see the current apparently quiet situation?
Well, I agree that there are a lot of positive signals. Vice Premier Liu He showing up at the talks was also very useful. And there are economic conditions that would encourage a settlement on both sides. But the negotiations are not transparent. So we don't know exactly what's happened. What we can see in terms of actions, beyond just talk actions, is that there have been some one-time purchases on the Chinese side, which will help the trade deficit. But the key question, which is structural issues regarding the Chinese economy, we really don't have any details on that. And that's the core of the negotiation. And willingness to address those issues will determine whether these negotiations will ultimately be successful.
Different people are looking at different emphasis for the possibility of negotiation, but if we look back in history, as we do not know yet the result of this negotiation, therefore history could be of a little bit of help. Mr. Stratford, you've been participating in many of those tough trade negotiations in the calm days and also in the turbulent days, let's just put it that way. How important is it that we leave some space for the negotiators to figure it out?
Well, it's very critical. If they don't, if you look like you're being bullied or you're cornered, it's hard for you to come out and representing a great nation and to be able to put something on the table. Also, you know, in my experience, the Chinese government are very tough negotiators, and they like to...
They would say the same thing about the American negotiators.
Well, we hope so. But they like to wait and put the best things on the table at the last when they really have an assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of each side's position.
So wait until the last moment. That's also one of the strategies of negotiation, isn't it, worldwide? Mr. Zhang, what about that?
I think that before this negotiation, actually Chinese side already did some of actions to show our sincere attitude.
Like what?
Yeah, for example, nowadays China's laws on foreign-funded enterprises will be revised, and the new law will have new terms. That is, local government cannot have enforcement of technology transfer for foreign-funded enterprises. That's very clear, rules of law. And meanwhile, from last year till now, if you look at banking sectors, auto sectors, already some of very good cases shows China further opening up, and we provided better market access for foreign investors.
So that's a kind of prelude to you, in a way, to set the stage for the current negotiation and for the future, and also China's own opening up and reform process, isn't it, Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I think so. We always say that the reform can progress much further if China is under some form of pressure, and I think here is our opportunity to actually push the reform further. And actually, before this negotiation, we've seen the Chinese government open up many of the sectors for foreign ownership, and indeed, many of the financial firms in China has seen increased foreign ownership already. And many other sectors, including the auto sectors as well. So I would say that even before this negotiation, China has endeavored to do its best to meet some of the U.S. demands.
But communication is extremely important, Mr. Moon, for a negotiation, and also for the outside, beyond the negotiation room, people in both countries and those key players in both countries understand what are some of the latest, rather than looking at the picture, let's just say, a few months earlier.
Yes, it is very important, and I think the issues are very well understood in both countries. And to pick up on some of the things that were just said, it is true that China is hinting at taking some very positive steps with regard to the laws. I think that from a Western perspective, there are questions about the impartiality of the Chinese judiciary, as well as whether any of these laws can actually be enforced. And as for opening up new sectors, for example, the financial sector, these issues have been discussed for many years, if not decades. I think that from the Western perspective, we would quote Michael Jordan and say, just do it. Let's stop talking about it, just do it.
I don't know whether Mr. Jordan really participated in the trade negotiations, but anyway, he could be a player in the future. But Mr. Stratford, on the other hand, there is the issue of not to put everything into the ideology basket. Because once we do that, it's going to be very difficult for any side to really come into negotiation, trade negotiation, rather than all the things much exaggerated and beyond. Mr. Stratford, how should we understand the importance of that?
Well, I think when we think about ideology in the States, we think about putting a label on something, and then everything is just determined by the label, and you don't go beyond that to the real details.
Right.
I think that What we need to do is look at the specific concerns that each side has and figure out a way to address those specific concerns. And so I don't think ideology has to be a major point. But for example, the U.S. is concerned about state-owned enterprises. Well, you have to explain why are you concerned, and if China's not willing to completely change its ownership system, what are the things that state-owned enterprises do that seem unfair in a competitive context to the United States, and can some adjustments be made so that the Chinese system can still continue the way China wants it to, but take care of legitimate concerns that the United States has?
It's an interesting point. One of the things, Mr. Hong, if I could call upon you now, is the two sides over the past few months of so-called trade war has been suffering a little bit of deficit trust of deficit. And therefore, how can the two sides negotiators work hard in order to come to certain kinds of consensus and common beliefs so that negotiation can take place on a relatively belief by both sides that they are sincere and they want to work it out? Only with that things can happen, isn't it? I mean, it's true for any kind of negotiation, whether trade or politics. So, Mr. Hong, what do you consider are some of these barometers that two sides, the negotiators particularly, have to work hard in order to get across to the other side?
Yeah, well, I think one has to see the trade negotiation as a win-win situation instead of one side bashing the other side.
But I guess that's why they come together, right? That's why they come together. Otherwise, they don't come into a negotiation if there's a totally lose and totally win situation for one side and the other, right, Mr. Hong?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I think at this critical juncture, one has to realize that the U.S. trade deficit is a structural problem. It has been there for a long time. It used to be Japan being the largest debtor for the U.S. and now it's China. But having said that, one has to see how the Chinese economy structure has been changing. It's going into a consumer-led economy. So as a result, we're actually seeing the trade surplus China has been enjoying for years is starting to shrink this year. And rather dramatically. And so as the Chinese consumer economy continues to grow, I would say that the Chinese trade surplus will continue to shrink, and indeed China will become one of the largest importing country for domestic consumption. So once that happens, longer term, one has to see that market access into the humongous Chinese market would probably be top of the agenda for many of the foreign firms want to operate in China.
Mr. Moon, also about that point, how the two sides will be able to establish, not only for this round of talks, but future rounds to come, right? To establish some basic consensus that the negotiators can feel they have at least some room to discuss and not let politics interfere in the underground real discussion going on in the negotiation room. That's very important. But what are those points?
Well, I think the most important thing is for us to remain focused specifically on the trade issues. The United States and China's interests intersect on almost every major issue that this world faces. And in the past, we've tried to keep trade and other issues in their own lane. So I think that's extremely important. And it's especially important as we talk about ideology and politics. We need to avoid any suggestion that this is a political exercise. This is an economic exercise dealing with the trading interests of countries, and we need to be very careful to stick to the specific facts and the obstacles and barriers that we're trying to remove so that both countries can become prosperous. That's our goal.
That is our goal. We hope that is the goal of many who are also watching our program today from both sides. Mr. Zhang, go to you. It is with history that we can learn. When China and the United States first established diplomatic relations, it was during the Cold War, and the two were on the very different front of the Cold War, and they could have the wisdom and the strategy and the way of doing things in order to be able to come together and surprise the world. Of course, you could say things have been changing, geopolitics as well, but still, there are a lot of wisdom that we can draw from the earlier rounds and the earlier generations, Mr. Zhang. What could be those that could inspire our negotiators and those in the two countries as well who are watching the negotiator day by day?
Of course, looking back to the history, such as the Soviet Union, Japan, when they become the second hand in the world, economic scale, and then the United States as the biggest, economy, and will blame on those countries and constrain their development.
That is one part of history, but the other history that I'm asking you is about when China and United States established diplomatic relations. It was enormous historical wisdom that we have to say 40 years ago. How could they be able to achieve that? And are we going to be able to go through this bump in the relationship? What does that take now?
Yeah, I think that 40 years ago, actually, two economies, looked at new situation between two sides and the global situation. And today, I think that both sides also need to have a new thinking ways to look at our situation and concerns and our different ideas, different status. And then I hope that between two countries we can have more practical manners to deal with issues.
Pragmatism, that seems to be the key word. Is that the key word you would like to say, Mr. Stratford?
Pragmatism is obviously important. I think also you need to have a longer-term perspective. Right now, we're very focused on the news cycle. We're focused on when is the next tweet going to come from the president, and we're not
on an hourly basis, in fact.
Yes, and so we need to be thinking more of, where are U.S.-China relations headed, and where do we want them to go? And I mean, both countries clearly understand that they'll be better off if we have a positive relationship. So we have to be thinking, okay, what are the areas of conflict and how are we going to resolve them? And I think the changing circumstances over the last few years means we have to rethink some of the assumptions that we've all taken for granted in the past year. And I think it'll take maybe 2, 3, 5 years for us to rethink that. But that's what our goal should be, is figuring out what is the new consensus that will form the basis of the relationship, including the economic relations.
I mean, Mr. Stratford, you were working under the Bush administration as an assistant trade rep, and Mr. Moon, you were working as an assistant trade rep for the Obama administration. Both parties, political parties, Democrat and also the Republican, obviously there's something about China that is consensus building between the two parties as well. So how important is it now we can draw some historical wisdom, Mr. Moon? I think it's extremely important right now. To you, what it is?
Well, historically in the United States, there was a consensus on trade with regard to China. China is recognized as a major trading player, and it's been very important to maintain good trading relations. But history also evolves, and the history of our trading relationship has also evolved. When we struck the WTO agreement, China was very much a developing country that received lots of breaks in terms of coming into the WTO. China is now the #2 largest economy in the world, and we need to change the parameters so that China accepts more of the responsibilities and gets fewer of the breaks that are necessary in order to make the trading relationship mutually beneficial. And I think that sagging support in the American business community reflects the fact that we need to even things out a bit and update our history and our trading practices.
Mr. Hong, of course, the responsibilities and also share of decision-making process, that also should become hand in hand, as we have seen over the past 100 years in the world change. But to China, what are some of the inspirations we can draw from the historical wisdom, let's just say, about China and the United States 40 years ago? And also, shall we say, at different stages, as Mr. Moon and Mr. Stratford put it, of this relationship developed over the years.
Yeah, well, we used to call the Chinese economy, the U.S. economy, being, one of the sort of mutually beneficiary economies. In the sense that China produce and U.S. consume, and also China helped to fund the huge physical deficit that the U.S. government has been experiencing over the years. So in either way you look at it, and also looking from a traditional economic perspective, trade by definition is mutually beneficiary to all parties involved. So it's a little difficult to comprehend how one could accuse China for abusing trade conditions and gaining benefits out of a mutually beneficiary relationship. But having said that, though, there's much to be done. Just now we discussed that the Chinese economy has matured substantially since 2001,
right?
And also the structure of the economy is changing. So I think from here onwards, we probably can learn from the developed countries, how to actually manage the transformation of the Chinese economy into a consumer-led economy.
I mean, economies have to work on their own issues in order to be a strong and also reasonable player worldwide as well. Before we go, we only have 2 minutes left, and we still do not yet have the latest at all from any statement or any result yet. Let's just put it that way. What do you think should be the work done by this round of negotiation for the future communications, probably negotiations as well, that could be taking place between the two sides? I would go one by one with every one of you. 30 seconds for each of you. Let's start with Mr. Moon.
Well, I think that certainly negotiations ought to proceed to the next round. That's what this round of talks was all about. I think that future discussions need to focus more on those structural issues. That's IPR, forced technology transfer, subsidies. Those are the hard issues. And I think that we ought to take our time. There's a lot of talk about a near-term agreement. If we reached a near-term agreement, we would not solve those structural issues. And if we don't solve them now, they're going to persist.
Okay.
So I think we ought to really roll up our sleeves and solve them.
Roll up your sleeves. You learn something from the China's recent phrase. And also, Mr. Zhang, that's what communication is about, isn't it?
I hope two sides can have a roadmap for our, bilateral economic and trade relationship. In short term, focusing on trade issues, and in midterm, maybe investment, IPR, something like that, and in the long term, comprehensive relationship. Yeah.
A lot of hard work you have outlined for us.
Yeah.
Mr. Stratford, 30 seconds for you.
So I agree with the roadmap idea. I think if we want to have an agreement, it's not a comprehensive agreement, but it agrees on certain steps that would be taken immediately that would help to build confidence, and then a roadmap for addressing other issues. And we have to remember that the principal issue is the state intervention in the economy and how much of that happens and what is the impact on all the competitors.
Different sides have different concerns. Mr. Hong, before we go, finally for you.
Yeah, there's an old Chinese saying, a journey of 1,000 miles starts from one single step. I think this round of the trade negotiation is a good first step.
All right. Thank you so much. We're taking our steps as well to map out what's likely to come and what should be coming. Thank you so much for the full of you for being with us on this important occasion. Zhang Jianping, Jeff Moon, Hong Hao, last but certainly not least, Timothy Stratford. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much.